Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Bluetech, Holotrope. Bluetech, that's Evan Mark Bartholomew, a down-tempo dub IDM artist from San Diego. This isn't the first time I've talked about him. At the very beginning of this year I reviewed his album Liquid Geometries. I'll link that video in the description. If you want the in brief segment on him, it'll be there. I'm not doing it in this video. But for those unfamiliar with Bluetech, he's an artist very much in the same mold as Sounds from the Ground, Magic Sound Fabric, 01, all those down-tempo and dub artists. I discovered him shortly after getting into those guys in high school. Now, I'll admit I don't really have interesting things to say about every single album of his. A lot of them kind of strike me as pretty similar. Like, I skipped over his last album, Sci-Fi Lullabies, for instance, that dropped earlier this year. It was cool stuff, but I didn't really have anything to say about it. It was a Bluetech album. And that was about it. While Bluetech is hardly a one-trick pony, he's also not the kind of artist that's exactly reinvented himself a lot over the years. His catalog isn't like SFTG's, where every album has its own distinct and different sound to it. He kinda sticks to an established sound and style, and consistently delivers solid stuff in that same mold. I'd say if you've never heard anything from him, I think the best starting point would probably be the expanded version of his debut here, Elementary Particles and Prima Materia. Specifically the one that has both the EP and the album, because the EP is great. And going from there, my other favorite projects from him are Phoenix Rising and Love Songs to the Source. The latter is a bit of a departure from the usual from him, as more vocal guests and more dub, but still really solid and pretty unique. As for this latest one, it did catch my interest a little more than usual. Well, it helped that I think like his agent or someone like that working with him hit me up on his behalf, asking me to review it and sent me a free copy. Which I'm always flattered by when it's an artist I've been following as long as Bluetech. I did have to tell her, okay, you're not necessarily guaranteed a video. Bluetech isn't the kind of artist that's always given me interesting stuff to work with, but this one did actually look promising because it has a pretty interesting structure. It's 12 tracks, grouped into 4 movements of 3 tracks that each blend into each other and seem to showcase different aspects to his style. An album that actually gets to showcase Bluetech's diversity as an artist is something I can definitely get on board for. It's one of my main problems with Liquid Geometries. And while Holotrope doesn't necessarily showcase anything I haven't already heard before from him, or reveal anything new to me about him, it is probably one of my favorite releases from him to date. Mainly because of that interesting and creative structure that it has. Like I said, Bluetech may have a bit of a formula, but he's not a one-trick pony, and this album shows what I mean by that. This album's 4 sections do all have their own feel to them and explore plenty of musical territory. They flow together super well and come together cohesively. I overall enjoyed this thing quite a bit, and I think I could even see myself hanging on to it in the long term. Not every moment is as compelling as the next, but just from a pacing and variety standpoint, this is one of my favorites from him in quite a while. So how about we break this thing down section by section? We'll just start from the beginning, with section 1, Descending. I mean, you can't have a great album without a great opener, and this album's opener, Stone, River, and Shadow, is one of the biggest highlights. Pulls you in right from the outset, with all its scintillating I can't say that word with a straight face. With all its scintillating layers of smooth synth textures and occasional vocal chanting echoing out from the background. It may be pretty low-key, but these are some melodies and chord progressions that do well to get me emotionally invested. Now going on from there, you get Afterimage Flare, a track that directly builds off the opener and feels like a second part to the piece. Like, I saw an interview Bluetech retweeted the other day where he talked about this album and how he composed each track on here in sequential order. The first track was the first one he made, the last track was the last one he made, etc. And he basically improvised these parts and built them off each other like that. And that method definitely shows. The female vocals throughout both of these first 2 tracks are a really nice touch. They make these major standouts for me. I will say the section's ending, Turning Inside Out, isn't quite as compelling as its first 2 parts, but it's still pretty good. And it's built out of the previous track nicely. Also has a slightly more skeletal feel to it that the previous tracks didn't. It still has a lot of layers to it, but I don't know, it feels like these elements are creating a bit more of an open space, drifting apart from each other ever so slightly. Definitely prefer the melodies and textures of the first 2 tracks, though. On to section 2, Expanding, which has a more offbeat and abstract bend to it than the other sections. It starts off pretty well with Blisswave 2.0, which in itself feels like it's like a two-parter of sorts. Just kind of abstract, polyrhythmic meandering at first, but about 3 minutes in as it changed up into some more video game-like synth textures, maybe a bit more of an up-tempo backbeat. And Seeing with the Eye, that one's cool too. It has this spacey hip-hop beat coming in underneath. That's a nice touch, helps set it apart. But then this trilogy finishes with Heart Logic, which doesn't really do anything the previous tracks didn't already, or delivers much of an interesting flavor in its own right. Still plenty of abstract and offbeat synth layers, and built well enough into the previously established groove to not give me the urge to skip it, but it doesn't really grab my attention. There's a lot of listens of this thing where I don't even notice this track is even there. I'll admit, of the 4 sections of this album, Expanding was probably the least personally engaging. It felt like it kinda ran out of steam at the end there. But thankfully, we move on to section 3, Ascending, which is my personal favorite stretch of the album. It's definitely the most energetic, just looking at a track like Spectral Currents, which suddenly has this spacey disco beat underneath the usual blend of synth layers. That grabbed my attention quite a bit. This track is probably my personal favorite on the album. The groove it created was really engaging and danceable. The slow down vocals in the background were a nice touch too, and made it marginally catchier. The next 2 tracks aren't as infectious or bright or energetic as Spectral Currents, but deliver compelling developments out of the patterns set by that track. Astral Cartography is a bit more IDM flavored, has some more 808 tinged percussion. That was fun and makes for an effective bridge between its 2 surrounding tracks. And Eyes Within Wheels brings the section full circle with another somewhat dancier techno feel with more straightforward rhythms, although noticeably more low-key than Spectral Currents. Still definitely retained my attention though, and had quite a hypnotic vibe to it that I could get behind and felt like an effective payoff to the previous 2 tracks. The more danceable flavors of this entire section definitely made it stick out in my head more than the others. And finally, section 4, Integrating, is our entirely beatless section. Not to say we don't have a pulse you can tap your foot to occasionally, just no percussion textures here. Like, it starts with Dissolution by Proxy, which aims to repurpose the patterns of the opener into something else that reminds me of the material on his Liquid Geometry album. Intro of that one is identical to Stone River and Shadow, same bass line too, but the patterns it builds up as it goes on are quite different. It has some very different emotional context. It doesn't feel as emotionally involving while I'm at it, but it's still another pretty solid track here. And thankfully the 3 tracks in this section all do have distinct flavors as well. Awakening / Serpent's Tail, for instance, has a much more formless structure to it, just layers of synths cascading around you without needing to adhere to any defined groove. Not sure why it has 2 titles, didn't really pick up on 2 distinct parts. I suppose maybe Awakening is the first minute and a half or so where it's just entirely just an ambient pad, but I don't know. Is what it is. Oh yeah, and this thing also has the synth arpeggio that runs throughout most of Blisswave 2.0 as well, which is cool. Took until my most recent listen to pick up on, but yeah, that's a nice touch. But finally, we close with The End is in the beginning is in the end, which is a mouthful of a title. And surprisingly, the best track in this section. Yeah, Integrating was the only one of the 4 movements where its 3rd track was its biggest highlight, but if any of them should finish strong, it should be the last one. It is a solid note to go out on, has a hopeful future-looking feel to it that's not too happy, but not too downbeat either. I think this ending actually echoes some synth patterns from Spectral Currents or other moments in the 3rd movement, which is interesting too. Now that I think about it, each of these tracks in this final movement incorporated elements of the first track of the previous 3 movements respectively, which makes the movement's title, Integrating, all the more fitting. Now that is a really cool touch! And you know what, it is a tiny detail like that which just barely pushed Holotrope into great territory for me. I'll be honest, most listens of this thing left me feeling like this was just really good and not quite great. Not every moment on here, as I said, is as compelling as the next. There weren't any tracks here like Elementary Particles that had a melody that could really get stuck in my head easily. And most damning of all, from the standpoint of like sound design and instrumental texture, Holotrope doesn't do anything that I haven't already heard plenty of times before out of Bluetech and other artists that operate within the same space as him, like Magic Sound Fabric and all those. But I've been repeatedly listening to this thing over the last couple of days. I've probably heard it about 8 times now, and honestly, I never really got sick of it. If anything, it's just been growing on me. Again, it may not reveal much to me about Bluetech that I didn't already know. It may have a couple of weak points here and there that I wasn't crazy about. But there's no tracks I was outright bored by. Even consistent low-light Heart Logic delivers all the texture and well-balanced production you'd typically want out of a Bluetech track, even if it doesn't go the extra mile. But I think what really sold me on this album was initially what I found most promising about it, looking over the track listing. And that was its improvisational 4-movement structure and the way it was laid out as a whole. It was the one thing about this album that stuck out to me and made me think, I haven't really seen that before. I also like how it's one of his most diverse albums to date. Each track on here does have a distinctive flair to it and follows its own style. Even the tracks near the end that reprise textures from earlier on do their own thing with it. This album is certainly never boring, so yeah, while this album is hardly perfect or the most incredible album I've heard all year, it's heck with it. Feels like there's been a bit of a drought of truly great electronic albums in 2019. I can definitely co-sign this. I'd say check it out, probably his best work since Love Songs to the Source, and I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review of something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.